What happens when a discovery doesn't fail? When it works? When a set of numbers refuses to behave, not because the math is wrong, but because the world itself feels negotiable. We like our science in tidy arcs: question, experiment, proof, applause. But every so often, the story bends into a quieter shape. A researcher stops answering emails. A lab is cleared overnight. A folder that once existed is suddenly not found. And everyone who remains learns a subtle lesson. Curiosity is noble, but curiosity has edges. This series begins at those edges, where wonder meets unease. Imagine 10 scientists scattered across the world, each chasing a different question. One studies consciousness and suspects it's not merely watching reality, but participating in its construction. Another stares at the slow arithmetic of aging and believes the body isn't breaking down so much as following instructions. A third listens to the brain's faint electrical weather and finds patterns that resemble communication, as if the mind is broadcasting more than it admits. Then there's gravity, old, faithful gravity, treated like a law until someone learns to treat it like a dial. And time, which we all accept as a one-way river until a physicist begins to suspect it has hidden inlets, places where information can slip upstream. Others go further. The so-called junk regions of DNA begin to look like software. Parallel realities become less like philosophy and more like engineering. Death, that final curtain, becomes a question mark. The universe itself begins to resemble code. These are not claims we will present as certainty. They are stories, some stitched from documents, some from whispers, some from the human habit of pattern-seeking. And yet, as stories, they have weight, because they orbit something undeniably real, the way knowledge can become inconvenient, and the way our species has always negotiated the boundaries of what it allows itself to know. If you've lived long enough, you've seen it in smaller forms. A family secret no one names at dinner. A workplace truth that's understood but never written down. A moment in history that is simplified, not because it's false, but because the full version asks too much of us. We don't only suppress facts for power. Sometimes we do it for peace. Sometimes for survival. Sometimes because the mind, any mind, needs a stable floor beneath it. And science, for all its rigor, is still a human activity. It happens inside bodies that get tired, inside institutions that protect their reputations, inside economies that turn discoveries into levers. That doesn't make science corrupt. It makes it alive. And anything alive learns to defend itself. So here is the question that will guide our journey. What if some breakthroughs don't simply change what we know, but change the kind of world we believe we live in? What if they threaten not only industries and careers, but our shared sense of reality, our agreement about what is possible, what is permitted, what is safe to imagine? There are two ways to hear stories like these. One is to leap straight into certainty, to decide that every absence is evidence of a plot, every missing person, proof of a hidden hand. The other is to dismiss it all as fantasy, the modern version of myth. We'll do neither. We'll walk a narrower path, one that holds space for doubt without mocking wonder, and for wonder without surrendering to it. Because even if the claims are exaggerated, even if the details blur, the emotional truth remains sharp. People devote their lives to understanding the universe, and sometimes the universe answers in ways that rearrange the questioner. Sometimes the cost of asking is not failure. It's being believed by the wrong people, for the wrong reasons, at the wrong time. In the next chapter, we step into a locked laboratory and a set of equations left unfinished, and we begin with the oldest mystery wearing new clothes, the relationship between consciousness and the world it tries to describe. It started, as so many modern mysteries do, with a door that shouldn't have opened. A laboratory at CERN, sealed by routine and protocol, held the quiet hum of machines that never slept. Fluorescent light pooled across metal benches. Screens glowed with graphs that looked, to an untrained eye, like weather maps of a storm no one could see. On the wall, a whiteboard carried the last handwriting of Dr. Elena Rodriguez, tight symbols, arrows, and box terms that seemed to insist on a single idea. The universe is not merely witnessed. It is, in some strange sense, negotiated. Rodriguez was a physicist by training, but she spoke like someone who had stared too long at the seam between disciplines. In meetings, colleagues recall, she didn't argue that consciousness was mystical. She argued it was measurable, not a ghost in the machine, more like a variable the machine had forgotten to include. The old story of physics said observation changes outcomes in certain experiments, but observation in that context could mean a detector, a sensor, any interaction that counts as measurement. Rodriguez pushed the definition inward. What if the mind is not a passenger to reality, but part of the steering wheel? She called her work observer theory. It wasn't poetry, it was math. It tried to formalize an unsettling possibility that human awareness doesn't just register the universe's behavior, but helps decide which version of behavior becomes real, not by wishing or hoping, but by participating, like a vote cast at a moment when the ballot is still blank. Over 8 years, she built the framework in increments, publishing careful pieces, never claiming more than she could defend. But the closer her equations came to completion, the more her friends noticed a change. She slept in irregular fragments. She began to speak of boundary conditions, not in the language of particles, but in the language of people, as if a thought could be a boundary too, as if belief itself was a kind of fence. Then came March 15, 2019. Rodriguez entered the lab. Security footage showed her badge, her profile, the familiar economy of movement that comes from long habit. Later that day, she failed to show for a scheduled check-in. A colleague went looking. The lab door was locked. The access log showed no exit. Inside, her notebook lay open, pages filled with equations that stopped mid-line. A pen rested, as if set down gently. The whiteboard carried a final segment of work, half erased, like she had tried to remove something and changed her mind. But Rodriguez was gone. In the days that followed, the story fractured into versions. Some said the lab had been too secure for an outsider to enter. Others insisted security systems were never as perfect as people imagine. A few whispered that she staged it, that she walked out wearing someone else's badge, slipping into the anonymity of a busy facility. And there were those who thought the strangest thing, that her disappearance was not an act of violence or escape, but a consequence. Because what do you do with a theory that implies the act of knowing is also an act of making? It's not hard to see why institutions would feel nervous. If consciousness is a meaningful variable, then experiments are no longer purely external. The observer can no longer pretend to be invisible, and if the observer matters, then the question becomes painfully intimate. Whose observation? Under what conditions? With what intent? Science has long relied on repeatability, on results that don't care who you are. Rodriguez's work, if interpreted recklessly, could be read as the opposite. Reality might depend, in part, on the quality of attention brought to it. But there's another way to hear it, quieter and more human. Perhaps Rodriguez was simply exploring a frontier where language breaks down. Perhaps she found an equation that suggested the universe is relational, not fixed, less like a statue and more like a conversation. And perhaps, staring at that possibility, she realized something we all sense in smaller ways, that attention shapes experience, that what we look for becomes, in time, what we see. The troubling part is not that the mind has power. The troubling part is that we don't fully understand the rules. When the investigators catalogued the room, they treated it like a crime scene. But to the people who knew her, it felt like something else, a sentence that ends without punctuation, a story that refuses to tell you what genre it belongs to. One moment, Rodriguez was a scientist at the world's most famous physics lab. The next, she was a gap in the record. And that gap left behind a question that hangs like a low, persistent note. If consciousness truly participates in reality, what happens when someone learns how to participate on purpose? In the next chapter, we move from the mind's shadow to the body's clock, into the work of a researcher who believed aging wasn't inevitable decay, but a program that could be rewritten. Aging looks ordinary from the outside, a birthday candle, a stiff knee, a face that changes in small, nearly polite increments. As if time is trying not to offend, we accept it as weather, something that happens to us, not something done by a mechanism. But inside the body, aging is not a mood. It's instruction. Cells dividing, proteins folding, genes turning on and off, repairs made and repairs skipped. It's a choreography of chemistry and compromise. Ahmed Al-Khatib believed compromise was optional. He didn't begin as a revolutionary. He began as a physician, watching patients do everything right and still decline. Diet, exercise, medication, discipline. The body eventually found its way back toward fragility. That pattern gnawed at him, not because he couldn't accept mortality, but because he couldn't accept that the body would obey deterioration as if it were a law when so much of biology was conditional. He left clinical work and went into a research institute in Basel, a place built of glass and quiet urgency. There, Al-Khatib joined teams studying epigenetics, the chemical markers that tell genes when to speak and when to stay silent. The genome, he liked to say, is the book. Epigenetics is the bookmark, the highlighter, the dog-eared page. Two people can have almost identical DNA and age differently, not because the letters change, but because the reading changes. He became obsessed with one question. If aging is largely a matter of gene expression drifting into chaos, could you restore coherence? Could you return a cell to a younger setting without turning it into cancer? In public, he was cautious. In private, he was luminous with possibility. His team focused on senescent cells, cells that stop dividing and begin secreting inflammatory signals like tiny factories of biological noise. Senescence has a role. It can suppress tumors. But as it accumulates, it becomes a burden, a neighborhood where every house is blasting sirens all night. The body's immune system tries to clear these cells, but over time, it tires. Al-Khatib's idea was to do two things at once: remove the loudest senescent cells and then reprogram the remaining tissue toward a healthier epigenetic pattern. He called it recalibration. The early results were small, cautious, and undeniably intriguing. Improved tissue function in animal models, recovery patterns that looked less like repair and more like reversal. It was as if the body remembered a prior version of itself, and given the right cues, tried to return there. He didn't claim immortality. He spoke of extension, quality, compression of illness, less of the long, slow unraveling, more of a life that stays itself until it doesn't. But with each promising data set, the room around him grew more crowded. Funding arrived quickly, the kind of money that comes with velvet gloves and sharp questions. Investors wanted timelines. Military representatives wanted resilience. Pharmaceutical partners wanted patents. And then there were the quieter visitors, people who asked, with a politeness that felt like a test, whether his work could be selectively deployed, as if youth could be a resource rationed like water. Al-Khatib began to keep two sets of notes, one for the official record, one for himself. He told a colleague late one night that the hardest part wasn't the science, it was the moral geometry of it. Because if you can slow aging for a few, you are forced to look at how we already decide who gets health and who waits. Medicine, in its best form, is compassion made practical. But the economics of medicine often run on scarcity. And the moment you touch aging, you touch the most fundamental scarcity of all, time. Then came the experiment that changed the air in the building. According to those who worked near him, Al-Khatib's team achieved a replication that shouldn't have been so clean. A set of biomarkers shifted in a pattern that suggested not merely a slowing of decline, but a coordinated rollback. In the data, tissues didn't just improve, they aligned, like a symphony tuning itself, like a system returning to a remembered baseline. It wasn't proof of a miracle, it was at most proof of a direction. But direction matters. Within days, the Institute tightened security. External collaborations were paused. Meetings were held without notes. Al-Khatib was advised, gently, firmly, to temper his public statements. He agreed because he understood the fragility of early claims. But friends say he grew quiet in a way that didn't feel like caution. It felt like containment. On November 2nd, 2020, he left the Institute after a long day and didn't return. His phone went dark. His apartment was undisturbed. His passport remained in a drawer. The last message he sent was to a former student. Protect the work, not for me, for what it could become. There are explanations that fit your inside ordinary reality, a voluntary disappearance, a mental health crisis, a fatal accident without a body recovered. Each is plausible, but plausibility is not comfort, because the work itself, even in rumor, presses on a deeper fear. Not that we will live forever, but that we will live unevenly. That time will become a commodity, and the rest of us will be asked to accept the new math. And so Al-Khatib's absence becomes another kind of evidence, not of conspiracy, but of the burden carried by anyone who approaches forbidden levers. Not forbidden by law, but by the moral tension they create. In the next chapter, we follow a different kind of signal, one that travels not through genes, but through the brain itself, into research that suggested thoughts might be readable and perhaps someday writable. If you've ever sat beside someone you love while they sleep, you've seen the brain from the outside, the soft rise of breath, the small twitch of fingers, the face unguarded. And beneath that stillness, a storm of activity, neurons firing, networks humming, memories rehearsing themselves like quiet theater. We talk about thought as if it's private property, locked behind bone. But the brain is an organ. It produces patterns, and patterns, given the right tools, can be measured. Dr. Mei Lin Park dedicated her life to that measurement. She worked out of a neurotechnology lab in Seattle, where the atmosphere felt halfway between a hospital wing and a music studio, clean, controlled, and full of listening. Park was known for her composure, for the way she could speak about the most intimate parts of human experience without stealing their dignity. When journalists asked her about mind reading, she corrected them gently. "We're decoding," she said. "We're translating signals. We're learning the brain's dialect." Her mission was medical. She wanted to help stroke patients communicate again, to let people with locked-in syndrome speak without moving, to give language back to those whose bodies had turned into cages. And for years, the work looked exactly like that. Electrode arrays, machine learning models, careful trials. A patient imagines moving a hand. The system learns the signature of that intention. A cursor moves. A silent person blinks through the alphabet in a faster, kinder way. Then Park's team began to notice something strange. Not every thought announces itself as an obvious command. Some emerge as textures, the faint echo of a remembered melody, the shape of a fear before it has words, the subtle difference between imagining a scene and recalling it. Park's models, trained first on motor intention, began picking up these textures, mapping them into categories with unnerving accuracy. At first, it felt like progress. Better models meant better communication. But one night, reviewing data, Park realized the system wasn't just predicting a planned movement. It was predicting the kind of thought a person was having before they consciously reported it. Not perfectly, not telepathically, but enough to make her pause and stare at the screen as if it had spoken. She started framing the problem differently. If you could decode internal states, even roughly, you could build tools that respond to the mind faster than language does. The therapeutic applications were obvious: detecting panic early, preventing seizures, guiding treatment for depression. But the other applications, unspoken yet present, were also obvious: surveillance, manipulation, advertising that doesn't wait for your choices but anticipates them, interrogation without questions. Park wasn't paranoid. She was realistic. She had read history. She knew that technologies rarely stay within the moral fences their inventors build. So she did what responsible scientists do. She tried to create boundaries. She wrote papers about consent. She argued that neural data should be treated like an organ donation: sacred, limited, reversible. She warned that decoding would inevitably lead to encoding. If you can read signals, you can learn to write them. Not in the crude way of science fiction, but in the subtle way of nudges, patterns that encourage certain moods, certain decisions, certain memories to rise more easily than others. The turning point came during an internal pilot study involving non-invasive stimulation paired with decoding. The goal was benign: to reinforce neural patterns associated with speech recovery. Participants would attempt to form words. The model would detect the pattern. Stimulation would lightly amplify the relevant circuits, like boosting a weak radio station. But according to a researcher who later spoke anonymously, something unexpected happened. One participant reported hearing a phrase in their mind that didn't feel like it came from them. Not an external voice, not hallucination, more like an intrusive thought with unusual clarity. Another participant described a sudden flood of childhood imagery while the system was active, as if the brain had been nudged into opening a drawer it hadn't touched in decades. Park treated these reports seriously. She paused the study. She interviewed participants herself. She reviewed the stimulation logs. Everything looked within parameters, yet the subjective experiences suggested a line had been brushed, if not crossed. She confided to a colleague that the brain might not distinguish cleanly between self-generated and externally reinforced patterns, that our sense of authorship, of "this thought is mine," could be more fragile than we admit. And if authorship is fragile, the ethics become enormous. Because memory isn't just a record, it's identity. It's how we know who we are, what we've survived, what we love, what we fear. To touch memory, even accidentally, is to touch the architecture of the self. In early 2021, Park was scheduled to present preliminary findings at a closed symposium. The title of her talk, according to the event program, was disarmingly plain: Adaptive Feedback Stimulation in Post-Stroke Language Recovery. But those close to her say she intended to address the risks openly, to argue for strict global regulation before the technology escaped the lab. She never gave the talk. The morning of the symposium, Park didn't arrive. Her assistant found her office door slightly ajar. Her laptop was gone. The external hard drives were gone. A notebook remained on her desk, opened to a page with a single sentence written in careful block letters. If we can write to the brain, we must decide who holds the pen. The official story said she resigned abruptly for personal reasons. No further details, no public search, no memorial. Just silence, as if the world had agreed to speak around her absence. Maybe she walked away by choice, an act of conscience. Maybe she was pulled away by pressure she couldn't name. Or maybe the simplest truth is the hardest, that she discovered something powerful and realized power is rarely allowed to remain innocent. In the next chapter, we leave the mind and the body and turn toward the planet itself, toward gravity, the most dependable force we know, and the engineer who believed it could be persuaded to behave differently. Gravity is the oldest promise we know. You drop a glass, it shatters. You throw a ball, it arcs. You step off a curb, your body returns to Earth with a reliability so complete, we stop noticing it. Gravity is not just a force, it's a background certainty, the invisible hand that keeps oceans in their bowls and bones in their shape. Dr. Viktor Sokolov treated that certainty as a hypothesis. He was an engineer, not a philosopher, the kind of man who spoke in schematics and tolerances. He grew up near the Baikonur region, where rockets rose like metal prayers and fell, sometimes, like failures you could hear from miles away. As a boy, he learned early that the sky was not empty, it was expensive. To leave Earth, you had to fight gravity with fuel. To stay in space, you had to keep paying the bill in calculations and corrections. Sokolov's question was brutally practical. What if we didn't fight gravity at all? What if we changed the terms? He didn't claim he could turn it off. He hated that phrase. Gravity, he insisted, was woven into space-time itself. But woven things can be tugged. They can be shaped. And he believed that certain materials, under extreme conditions, might interact with space-time in subtle ways, creating a local distortion that looked from the outside like reduced gravitational coupling. He called it field biasing. The name sounded harmless, like a software setting. But the implication was not harmless at all. His lab was a converted industrial space on the outskirts of Novosibirsk, chosen for its distance and its electrical capacity. Inside, the work felt like a cross between metallurgy and music. Coils wound like careful handwriting. Cryogenic lines hissed. Sensors listened for changes so small they could be mistaken for the building settling. For years, Sokolov's results were non-results. Noise, drift, artifacts. Anyone who has done experimental work knows this phase. The constant negotiation with error. The suspicion that your cleverness is merely your ability to fool yourself. He published nothing beyond a few dense technical notes that drew little attention. Then, in late 2018, the lab saw an anomaly that refused to behave like a mistake. A test object, small, precisely measured, showed a deviation in weight within a narrow window of the setup's operating cycle. It wasn't dramatic, no levitation, no floating wrenches. It was a fraction, a whisper, but it happened repeatedly enough that the team began to stare at one another with the kind of fear that looks like excitement. Sokolov responded the way good scientists do. He tried to kill the result. He checked for vibration, for thermal gradients, for electromagnetic interference, for sensor bias. He reran calibrations until his assistants looked pale. The effect diminished under certain configurations and strengthened under others, as if it was sensitive to geometry and timing. That sensitivity made it harder to dismiss. Noise is usually indifferent. This seemed picky. Word traveled not publicly, but through the subterranean channels of research funding, the conferences where people talk over coffee, the emails with vague subject lines, the invitations that arrive without context. Soon, visitors began appearing at the lab. Aerospace consultants, defense-linked engineers, administrators who asked questions about scalability before they asked about error bars. Sokolov disliked them immediately, not because they were villains, but because they brought a different kind of gravity into the room. The weight of application. If the effect was real, and that if mattered, then the implications unfolded fast. Fuel efficiency, launch costs, maneuverability, novel propulsion concepts, but also weapons. A device that can bias fields could potentially interfere with guidance systems, alter trajectories, destabilize structures, change what is up for the enemy. Even the faintest lever, scaled, becomes a crowbar. Sokolov had hoped to keep it purely scientific until he understood it. But the world doesn't wait for understanding. It waits for advantage. He grew careful. He stopped speaking openly even to colleagues outside the lab. He refused some funding offers. He accepted others with conditions. And he began to write, obsessively, in a private journal. Pages of technical detail laced with reflections that felt almost religious. "We treat gravity as law," one entry read. But law is written. By whom? In March 2020, the lab prepared a larger demonstration. The setup was upgraded. Stronger coils, colder temperatures, tighter isolation. The test object was heavier, the measurements more precise. If the effect scaled, it would be harder to deny. That night, the power cut out. Not a simple outage. The building's backup systems failed too, as if the facility had been unplugged from reality. Security cameras recorded only static. When the team returned at dawn, the main apparatus had been partially dismantled. Components were missing, specific ones, not random. The journal was gone. The server was wiped with professional thoroughness. Sokolov was not there. A week later, a short email arrived in a colleague's inbox from an address no one recognized. It contained a single line: "Some doors open both ways." The police report listed it as a suspected abduction or voluntary disappearance. The truth, like gravity itself, remained unseen, known only by its effects. But what lingered, long after the equipment was replaced and the lab rebranded, was the sensation that something foundational had been nudged. Because if gravity can be biased, even slightly, then the universe is not only measurable, it is negotiable. In the next chapter, we turn from force to time, toward a physicist who believed information could travel in stranger directions than we allow ourselves to imagine. Time feels like the most democratic thing in the universe. It moves for everyone. It ignores your status. It doesn't pause for grief or speed up for joy. It is the current that carries all lives in the same direction. And we learn to call that direction forward because we have no other word for it. Dr. Josephine Jo Mercer was the kind of physicist who distrusted words like forward. She worked at a small but highly respected institute in Cambridge, the kind of place where chalk dust still mattered and the most intense conversations happened on stairwells. Mercer's specialty was not the flashy end of physics, not headlines or bold claims. She studied information, how it moves, how it's conserved, how it's lost. She lived in the sober world of thermodynamics, where time's arrow is usually explained as entropy. Disorder tends to increase, so the future is the direction in which things become harder to reverse. But Mercer kept finding little exceptions in the margins. Not violations of physics, nothing so dramatic. More like loopholes. In certain quantum systems, information didn't behave like a spilled drink soaking into carpet. It behaved like something that could be hidden, moved, reassembled. She became fascinated by the idea that irreversibility might not be absolute, but emergent, a collective illusion created by too many interacting parts. Her colleagues teased her. "Joe wants to unbreak eggs," they'd say. She smiled and went back to work. What she wanted, more precisely, was to understand whether the past is truly gone or merely inaccessible. Her breakthrough came from a mathematical approach that treated time not as a line, but as a constraint. Instead of imagining particles traveling through time, she imagined correlations across time, relationships between events that could be described without assuming a fixed direction. In her papers, she used careful language, retrocausality as a possibility, not a conclusion. She never said tomorrow could rewrite yesterday. She asked whether information could appear to do something like that under extreme conditions. Then she built an experiment designed to fail. It involved entangled photons and a detection scheme that, on paper, should produce outcomes that were statistically indistinguishable from randomness unless certain conditions were met. The conditions were odd. They depended on choices made after the photons were already in flight. The standard interpretation was that no signal traveled backward. Rather, the correlations were non-classical, and the whole system had to be described as a single entity. Mercer accepted that. But she wondered if no signal was a semantic comfort, because even if nothing traveled backward in the ordinary sense, the structure of the experiment suggested something haunting, that the present's questions helped define the past's meaning. Her students called it the delayed whisper. In late 2022, Mercer's lab began seeing a pattern that was too consistent to ignore. Not a message, not a readable code, more like a bias. A subtle tilt in probabilities that aligned with post-selection choices more strongly than their models predicted. At first, they assumed a hidden variable, a leak, an unaccounted drift, a computational mistake. Mercer insisted on the least romantic interpretation. She made them repeat everything, blind the analysis, swap detectors, run nights without telling each other the settings. The bias remained. She didn't celebrate, she grew quiet. Because a bias is a lever, and levers invite hands. If her results suggested that information could be constrained across time in ways that felt like influence, then the implications spiraled outward. Secure communication, novel computing architectures, new interpretations of causality, but also the darker applications. Prediction that isn't prediction, inference that feels like knowledge, the ability to shape outcomes by choosing how you ask questions, when you ask them, and what you allow yourself to see. Mercer wrote a private note to a friend. If the future participates, the ethical terrain changes. We aren't just discovering a world, we're negotiating with it. As her team prepared a manuscript, Mercer began receiving invitations she hadn't sought. Closed workshops, private dinners, conversations that framed her work in terms of strategic advantage. She declined politely. The invitations continued, growing less polite. Then, one evening in January 2023, she left the institute after a late seminar. It was cold enough to make the air feel brittle. She texted her partner that she was walking home. She never arrived. Her phone was found 2 days later, near the river, dry and uncracked, as if set down deliberately. The last thing on the screen was an unsent draft message. If this is real, it doesn't belong to anyone. The Institute issued a statement about a missing colleague, expressed concern, and then, slowly, fell into a procedural silence. The lab's servers were audited. Access was restricted. Mercer's students were reassigned. Her manuscript, once nearly finished, was suddenly under review in a way that seemed to have no end. Some people said she must have suffered a personal crisis, stepped out of her life, disappeared into anonymity. Others suspected something worse. But the most unsettling possibility wasn't about what happened to Mercer. It was about what happens to a world in which time is not merely a flow, but a relationship, where the future can't be cleanly separated from the past, and where the question, what comes next, begins to sound uncomfortably like, who gets to decide? In the next chapter, we enter a different kind of code, written not in equations or photons, but in the long, quiet language of DNA, where one scientist believed the so-called junk might be the most important sentence of all. In the early days of genetics, the story sounded simple. DNA was the blueprint. Genes were instructions. Everything else, those long stretches that didn't obviously code for proteins, was dismissed as noise. Junk, the biological equivalent of blank pages in a book. It was a comforting idea because it kept life legible. It suggested that complexity lived in the parts we could name. Dr. Priya Nanduri didn't trust comfort. She worked in a genomics lab in Bangalore with a view of rain and traffic and the restless human scale of the city. Nanduri had the rare ability to make molecular biology feel like a form of listening. She spoke about DNA as if it were music, motifs returning, rhythms shifting, silences that weren't empty but deliberate. Her obsession was the non-coding genome, not because she believed in mystical secrets, but because she believed evolution is not wasteful. If 98% of the genome truly did nothing, it would be one of nature's most extravagant habits. Yet nature is ruthless. It prunes. It reuses. It hides function in layers. Nanduri's work sat at the intersection of computational genomics and cell biology. Her team analyzed patterns in non-coding regions, repeats, palindromes, clusters that appeared conserved across species. They used machine learning to find structures that looked less like random drift and more like architecture. Over time, a hypothesis took shape. The non-coding genome might function as a regulatory operating system, controlling timing, context, and response. Not just on-off switches, but networks of switches, controlling other switches, building cascades of meaning. The protein-coding genes were like hardware components. The non-coding regions were like firmware, subtle instructions that determine how the hardware behaves under different conditions. Then she noticed something that didn't fit. Certain non-coding sequences responded to external stimuli in ways that looked almost like passing. Cells exposed to specific stresses, chemical, thermal, electromagnetic, showed regulatory changes that were not merely defensive, but structured, as if the genome was reading the environment and selecting responses from a library. Again, she didn't call it intelligence. She called it adaptive syntax. The term sounded harmless, academic, but the idea underneath it was bold, that biology contains a language of regulation more sophisticated than we've mapped, and that by learning its grammar, we could rewrite health at the level of control systems, not just individual genes. The medical implications were immediate. Autoimmune disorders might be soothed not by suppressing the immune system, but by correcting regulatory misfires. Cancer could be treated not only by killing cells, but by changing the instructions that lead them to misbehave. Neurological diseases might be addressed by tuning expression patterns over time, like guiding a river back into its banks. But Nanduri's hypothesis also carried another implication, one that felt like science fiction until you put it into the mouth of a grant officer. If the non-coding genome is an operating system, then it can be hacked, and hacking, once you name it, attracts certain kinds of interest. In 2021, Nanduri's lab began collaborating with a private biotech firm that offered resources her university could not. High-throughput sequencing at scale, specialized reagents, access to rare data sets. The partnership seemed pragmatic, even necessary. But soon, the firm's representatives started asking for access not just to results, but to models, specifically the ones that predicted regulatory changes in response to environmental triggers. Nanduri pushed back. She insisted on open science principles, transparency, peer review. The firm spoke warmly about innovation, then quietly tightened the contract language. Her university administrators urged compromise. The lab's funding depended on it. She felt the familiar pressure of modern research, the struggle between discovery and ownership. Then came the breakthrough that changed how she spoke. During a late-stage analysis, her team identified a cluster of non-coding sequences that behaved like a control hub, an unusually influential regulatory region that appeared to coordinate multiple pathways linked to inflammation, repair, and cellular stress. When the team edited this region in vitro using precise tools, the cells didn't merely change one behavior. They changed their overall response profile, like a personality shift. The same insult produced a calmer reaction. The same damage triggered faster repair. It was as if they had found a master dial. Nanduri called it, privately, the conductor. She drafted a paper with meticulous caution. She avoided metaphors. She framed the discovery in orthodox terms: regulatory architecture, enhancer networks, epigenetic modulation. But in her notes, her language loosened. "We've been looking at genes like piano keys," she wrote. "This is the sheet music." And she began to worry. Because if you can find a conductor in the genome, you can change the tempo of biology. You can make bodies more resilient. You can also make them more compliant, more vulnerable, more responsive to triggers. Not necessarily through overt genetic engineering, but through regulatory manipulation, subtle, scalable, difficult to detect. In early 2022, Nanduri was invited to present at an international symposium. The invitation was flattering. The terms were strange. The audience was described vaguely as interdisciplinary stakeholders. She asked for more detail and received a polite deflection. She declined. 2 weeks later, her lab was audited. Not a normal audit. A sudden, aggressive inspection focused on data handling and compliance. Servers were imaged. Drives were confiscated. Graduate students were questioned. Nanduri was instructed not to discuss ongoing work publicly. Then, one morning, Her building access card stopped working. She was not fired. She was on leave. The phrase carried the soft violence of bureaucracy. Days later, her colleagues received a brief email from her account. "I'm safe. Please don't look for me. Protect the students. Keep the work human." No one heard from her again. In the absence of facts, rumors grew like mold. Some said she accepted a private offer and vanished into industry. Others believed she was silenced for refusing to cooperate. But even without certainty, her story leaves behind a clean, unsettling idea. The most powerful parts of our biology may not be the ones that build us, but the ones that tell building blocks how to behave. And that raises a question as old as medicine and as new as machine learning. If we learn to edit the operating system of life, who gets administrator access? In the next chapter, we shift from the code inside us to the possibility of other codes, other worlds, following a researcher who believed parallel realities were not merely theory, but something that could leave fingerprints in our own. Some ideas are so strange we keep them at a safe distance by calling them interpretations. Parallel universes, many worlds, branching realities. The phrases sound like a late-night thought experiment, the kind of thing you say half-jokingly so you can retreat if someone takes you seriously. But in physics, the concept isn't born from fantasy. It grows out of mathematics that refuses to collapse into a single story. Dr. Layla Hassan didn't treat the multiverse like a metaphor. She treated it like a measurement problem. She worked at a research center outside Toronto where the winters sharpened everything: air, light, and sometimes the mind. Hassan had a reputation for unusual calm. She was the kind of scientist who could listen to a wild hypothesis without flinching, then ask the one question that made it either rigorous or impossible. Her field was quantum foundations, the part of physics that asks what the equations mean, not just how to use them. For years, she taught the standard options: Copenhagen, hidden variables, decoherence, many worlds. Students argued, professors smiled, everyone returned to their grant proposals. The multiverse remained a conceptual backdrop, elegant and untestable. Hassan wanted testable. Her entry point was not philosophy. It was noise. In ultra-sensitive measurements, interferometers, superconducting devices, quantum sensors, there's always noise, a restless jitter that limits precision. Most of it has known causes: thermal fluctuations, electromagnetic interference, mechanical vibration, the imperfections of materials. But some noise remains stubbornly featureless, like a hiss that doesn't care how carefully you build the room. Hassan wondered if part of that hiss wasn't local at all. She developed a model she called cross-branch correlation. The idea was careful, almost timid. If many worlds is more than a story, and if decoherence is not perfectly isolating, then in principle, there could be extremely faint statistical signatures, patterns that wouldn't look like messages, but like correlated randomness. Not communication, not travel, just a subtle echo across branches, like two distant radios catching the same atmospheric crackle. Her colleagues were skeptical. They had every right to be. Most attempts to test many worlds either smuggle in assumptions or collapse into interpretations again. Hassan tried to avoid the trap by focusing on what could be measured without claiming too much: deviations in noise distribution under specific experimental geometries, repeatable statistical anomalies, correlations that shouldn't exist if the system were purely isolated. She built the experiments slowly, like someone assembling a delicate instrument to hear a sound no one believes exists. In 2023, her lab began running a series of overnight trials. The setup was designed to reduce known noise sources to the lowest practical floor. The data was processed by multiple independent pipelines to avoid the seductive mistake of seeing what you want. For months, the results looked like what skepticism demands: nothing. Then, in late autumn, the anomaly appeared, a faint but consistent deviation in the noise spectrum, too structured to be random drift, too small to be an obvious equipment failure. The strange part wasn't the deviation itself, it was how it behaved. It didn't scale with temperature the way thermal noise should. It didn't respond to shielding the way electromagnetic interference should. It changed with geometry, as if the shape of the experimental arrangement mattered more than the material. Hassan didn't call it proof. She called it the ridge. It was a feature in the data, a small ridge where a flat line should have been. But to her, it felt like a handprint on a window. She asked her team to replicate it with a different apparatus. The ridge appeared again, weaker but present. She asked a collaborating lab in another country to attempt a similar configuration without telling them exactly what to look for. When their preliminary results returned, she sat alone in her office for a long time, reading the graphs as if they were letters from someone she had never met. If the ridge was real, and that if mattered, then it suggested not that we could travel between universes, but that the boundary between here and elsewhere might not be as absolute as we assume. Not a door, a membrane, a statistical seep, and membranes invite probing. Soon, Hassan began receiving messages that didn't come from journals. People asked whether the effect could be amplified, whether it could be shaped, whether it could be used to generate non-local randomness for cryptography. That request sounded benign until you considered the next one: whether correlations could be engineered to bias outcomes. Bias outcomes. In other words, influence. Hassan tightened access to her data. She stopped attending certain conferences. She began carrying a small notebook instead of using cloud storage. Friends noticed she grew cautious about her own words, as if she feared that the wrong metaphor could turn her work into someone else's weapon. One evening, she called an old mentor and said, "If reality branches, then every choice creates a family tree. But what if something is learning to prune?" It was an odd sentence, spoken like a question she didn't want to ask herself. In February 2024, Hassan was scheduled to submit her ridge paper to a top journal. Her co-authors had reviewed the drafts. The figures were clean. The language was restrained. It was the kind of paper that would spark debate, not headlines. 2 days before submission, her university email account was locked due to security concerns. Her office was searched under the pretense of an IT investigation. Her lab access was temporarily suspended. And then, in the space of a weekend, her project was reassigned to an administrative committee for oversight. Hassan vanished in the quietest possible way. No dramatic disappearance caught on camera. No river, no empty apartment, no official statement. Just a sudden absence from meetings, unanswered calls, and a terse message sent from an unfamiliar number to one of her students. "Please stop. It isn't safe to keep asking the universe to show its seams." Maybe she was frightened by what the data suggested. Maybe she was pressured to step away. Maybe she chose silence as a form of protection, for herself, for her team, for a world not ready to treat reality as plural. But her story leaves a lingering image: a scientist staring at a ridge in the noise, hearing in that faint pattern the possibility that our universe is not alone. And that, in some subtle way, it might not be entirely sealed. In the next chapter, we follow a different boundary, the line between life and death, where one researcher believed the final moment might be less like a door closing and more like a signal fading into another kind of darkness. Death is the one topic that makes even confident people speak more softly. It's not only the fear of ending, it's the fear of not knowing what an ending is. We can measure a heartbeat, a breath, a brainwave, but the person, the lived presence behind the measurements, doesn't fit neatly into a graph. In hospitals, death is a clinical event. In families, it is a weather system. In the mind, it is a question we carry like a stone. Dr. Samuel Okoye approached that stone with instruments. He was a neurologist and palliative care researcher based in Chicago, a man known for his steady eyes and his refusal to reduce patients to data points. Okoye did not chase immortality. He chased clarity. He wanted to understand what happens in the brain during the transition we call dying, not to conquer it, but to reduce suffering, to honor experience, to separate myth from physiology without stripping away meaning. His research began with a humane observation. Many patients near death report vivid experiences, lights, voices, a sense of leaving the body, a sudden review of life, a feeling of overwhelming peace, or, sometimes, fear. These reports are often dismissed as hallucinations or elevated as proof of an afterlife. Okoye refused both extremes. He treated them as phenomena, experiences that happen to real people at the boundary of life, worthy of careful study. He built a study around consent, comfort, and dignity. Patients who were already receiving end-of-life care could opt in. Families could witness. No invasive procedures, only non-invasive EEG monitoring, vital signs, and gentle post-event interviews when possible. The goal was simple: map subjective reports to objective patterns. For months, the data was what you'd expect. Variability, no single signature. A spectrum of dying as wide as the spectrum of living. Then Okoye's team began noticing something that felt less like variability and more like structure. In a subset of cases, the EEG showed a late surge of organized activity, high-frequency coherence patterns that resembled, in some respects, the brain states associated with focused attention and memory integration. It didn't happen in every patient. It didn't happen the same way. But when it did, it was striking, a final orchestration, as if the brain, facing shutdown, briefly gathered itself into a last, concentrated effort. Okoye called it the lantern, not because he believed it was a soul leaving the body, but because it looked like a light turning on inside a house that was otherwise going dark. He approached the finding with discipline. He ruled out artifacts. He cross-checked equipment. He compared medication profiles. He asked whether the patterns could be seizures. Sometimes they were. Sometimes they weren't. The lantern wasn't a single explanation. It was a shape that kept appearing at the edge of endings. The philosophical implications arrived without invitation. If the dying brain can enter a brief state of heightened coherence, what is it doing? Is it distress? Is it release? Is it the mind's attempt to make sense of its own disappearance? Are the vivid reports of near-death experience correlated with this lantern's state? And if so, does that mean those experiences are real in the only way experiences can be real to the person living them? Okoye's work threatened no corporations. It promised no weapon. It wasn't even particularly profitable. And yet it touched something that societies protect fiercely, the narrative we tell about death. Because death is not only biology, it is culture. It shapes religion, law, medicine, grief, and the way we treat one another. If Okoye's research suggested that dying includes a final window of heightened inner life, then end-of-life care might need to change. The handling of sedation, the timing of conversations, the presence of family, the respect for what may be happening behind closed eyes. And if the lantern correlated with certain drugs or conditions, it could open a new ethical debate. Should we try to preserve that coherent state to allow a person to complete something? Or should we suppress it if it's linked to distress? How do you make that choice when the person may not be able to tell you what they feel? Okoye began asking these questions, publicly, gently, without certainty. He spoke at conferences about the need for humility. He emphasized that correlation is not metaphysics. Still, the word spread in the way sensitive words spread. Quietly, urgently. In 2024, he received a message from a private foundation offering substantial funding. The proposals sounded noble. Expand the study, build a multi-hospital network, gather more data, publish definitive results. Okoye was tempted, not by money for its own sake, but by the possibility of scale. Better data could mean better care. But the Foundation's contract contained a clause about data ownership and publication veto. Okoye refused. Soon after, his hospital administration began questioning the study's reputational risk, not its ethics, those had been vetted, its optics. The fear was vague, that the research could be misused by media, misunderstood by the public, politicized by groups looking for certainty. Okoye argued that silence is also a choice, and not a neutral one. He insisted on transparency and careful communication. Then, on a warm evening in June 2024, he left his office after a late family meeting. A security guard later said he seemed tired but calm. He walked toward the parking garage and never reached his car. His badge was found near a stairwell. His phone was missing. The CCTV feed in that corridor, according to a brief internal report, had malfunctioned. The hospital issued a statement about a missing physician. The study was paused pending review. The data servers were restricted. Some of Okoye's notes were returned to his team with pages missing, as if someone had edited his thoughts. There are ordinary explanations: a crime of opportunity, a private crisis, an accident. But the timing, the missing pages, the sudden bureaucratic freeze, these details created a silhouette that was hard to ignore. Okoye had touched the lantern, and in doing so, he had touched the dignity of endings. Even if no one silenced him, the world itself may have done what it often does to difficult knowledge. It softened it, filed it down, tried to tuck it back into a drawer, labeled unknowable. And yet, the lantern remains in the imagination, a possibility that changes how you sit beside someone you love as they sleep, how you think about the last room we all will enter. In the next chapter, we return to the outermost scale, toward a physicist who looked at the universe and believed, not metaphorically but mathematically, that reality might be running on something like code. There is a moment, late at night, when the world feels like a simulation even if you don't believe in simulations. Streetlights repeat at exact intervals. The hum of appliances becomes a steady drone. A notification sound appears, disappears, appears again. Life starts to resemble a loop, beautiful, exhausting, strangely patterned. Most of us shrug that feeling off as fatigue. Dr. Keon Alvarez treated it as a research question. Alvarez was a theoretical physicist with an unusual resume, part cosmology, part computer science, part unapologetic curiosity. He taught at a university in Northern California where the students wore hoodies to lectures and asked questions with the confidence of people raised alongside algorithms. Alvarez loved their energy, but he feared their cynicism. He often reminded them that the universe, whether it is code or not, remains sacred in the way any unrepeatable experience is sacred. His work centered on a simple, dangerous idea. If the universe has underlying computational structure, it may leave fingerprints in places we can measure. Not the Matrix, not a cartoonish programmer in the sky. Alvarez's version was quieter. Perhaps reality, at its most fundamental level, is constrained by information processing limits. If so, space-time might not be infinitely smooth, but discretized, like pixels too small to see. Physical constants might behave like parameters, and certain glitches might appear as statistical anomalies in cosmic phenomena, the way compression artifacts appear in a video when the bitrate is stressed. He called it informational cosmology. For years, Alvarez was mostly ignored outside a niche circle. His papers were rigorous but unfashionable, the kind of work that provokes eyebrow raisers more than applause. He didn't mind. He believed the best ideas often begin as embarrassing questions. Then he found a pattern in the sky. It began with cosmic microwave background data, the faint afterglow of the early universe. Teams across the world had mapped it with extraordinary precision, and most features fit standard models beautifully. But Alvarez noticed something in the residuals, in the leftover noise after known structures were accounted for. The anomalies weren't large. They weren't obvious. They were subtle regularities. Small-scale correlations that appeared at intervals that felt too neat, too periodic to be purely natural. The first time he saw it, he assumed he had made a mistake. He rewrote his code. He used different data sets. He asked collaborators to run the analysis independently without telling them what to expect. The pattern weakened in some treatments, strengthened in others, but it didn't vanish. It behaved like a ghost that refused to leave the room. He nicknamed it the lattice, not as a claim, but as a placeholder for a suspicion that space-time might have a hidden grid-like structure, an informational scaffolding that becomes visible only under the universe's most ancient light. If such a lattice existed, it could explain certain cosmological puzzles and predict others. It could offer constraints on quantum gravity models. It could, in the most provocative interpretation, imply that the universe is not continuous in the way we intuit. Alvarez knew how this sounded. He knew how quickly people would leap from discrete space-time to simulation. He tried to keep his language clean. He framed everything as tests and limits, not metaphysical declarations. But even clean language has consequences when the implications are existential. Because if reality is fundamentally informational, then physics becomes less like a hunt for substance and more like a hunt for rules. And rules imply a rule set. And a rule set implies a kind of authorship, even if that authorship is simply nature's own necessity. Alvarez began to speak about it in interviews, carefully. He emphasized humility. "We don't know," he said, "but we can ask." He argued that human beings have always feared the possibility that their world is not what it seems, not because illusion is horrifying, but because it threatens meaning. If the universe is code, some worry, then love is code, grief is code, morality is code. Alvarez insisted the opposite, meaning lives in experience, not in the substrate. A poem written in ink is still a poem if written in pixels. Still, his work attracted attention from places that didn't care about poetry. A tech consortium invited him to private meetings, eager to discuss computational constraints on physical systems. A government-linked think tank asked whether a lattice model could improve prediction in chaotic systems. An investor group wanted to know if informational cosmology could lead to new encryption methods, keys that leveraged fundamental randomness, or perhaps fundamental structure. Alvarez was polite, but he grew uneasy. He had intended to explore the universe. He felt as if the universe was being turned into a resource. Then something happened that shifted him from curiosity to alarm. While refining the lattice analysis, Alvarez found an artifact that looked less like periodic correlation and more like compression, an apparent limit on information density in the dataset that aligned with a theoretical bound he had derived months earlier. It was the kind of alignment that makes a scientist's stomach drop, not because it proves you're right, but because it suggests the universe may be answering you in your own language. He wrote to a colleague, "Either this is the most elegant coincidence of my career, or we are seeing a constraint that doesn't care about our metaphors." He planned to publish. He drafted a paper that began with caution and ended with an invitation. If the lattice is real, then other independent observations should show compatible signatures. It was a paper designed to be disproven by the community if wrong, confirmed by the community if right. That is how science is supposed to work. 2 weeks before submission, Alvarez's lab was hit with a data breach. At first, it looked like a simple hack, the kind universities endure constantly, but the attacker didn't steal credit card numbers or personal files. They accessed a narrow set of folders containing code, intermediate results, and annotated notes. They copied specific versions. They deleted nothing. It felt less like vandalism and more like extraction. Alvarez reported it. The university responded with standard procedures. But then the pressure arrived from another direction. He was advised quietly, unofficially, to delay publication until the security situation stabilizes. He was offered a consulting contract that would, in effect, place his work behind a wall. He declined. Not long after, Alvarez began noticing small interruptions in his life. A car that followed him for 3 blocks and then disappeared. Calls that clicked before anyone spoke. A conference invitation that was rescinded without explanation. None of it was proof of anything. It could have been paranoia. It could have been coincidence. But the pattern, for a man who studied patterns, felt too familiar. On September the 9th, 2024, Alvarez left campus after teaching a late class. He was seen in the parking lot speaking to someone beside a dark vehicle. The security camera angle didn't catch faces. It caught only the gesture. Alvarez lifting one hand, palm up as if asking a question. He did not return home that night. His office remained intact. His chalkboard held the last lines of his work, a set of equations boxed in the corner, and beneath them, a sentence written in plain English, almost childlike in its directness. If the universe runs on rules, who gets to change them? The question is not an accusation. It is a mirror. Because even if Alvarez's lattice was only a statistical mirage, the deeper truth still stands. When knowledge begins to sound like power, it stops belonging to the person who found it. It becomes contested. It becomes guarded. It becomes dangerous. In the next chapter, we follow a scientist who believed power could be harvested not from gravity or time or code, but from the vacuum itself, the restless nothing that may be the most active thing in the cosmos. Nothingness is not empty. That sentence sounds like a riddle until you spend time with modern physics. The vacuum, what we casually call nothing, is a seething landscape of potential, a restless baseline where fields fluctuate even when no particles are present. It is quiet only in the way a deep ocean is quiet, full of motion you can't see. Dr. Amina El-Sayed believed the vacuum was not only restless, she believed it was useful. El-Sayed was an experimental physicist in Alexandria, the kind of researcher who liked hardware more than headlines. She had the hands of a builder, steady, practical, unafraid of messy work. She grew up near the Mediterranean, where the horizon teaches you that emptiness can still contain weather. Her field was quantum field dynamics, but her focus was painfully concrete: energy. She hated waste. She spoke often about the way humanity burns ancient sunlight, coal, oil, gas, as if it were the only language we know. She wasn't naive about renewables or the complexity of grids. She simply believed that if the vacuum truly contains fluctuations, then there might be a way, however small, to couple to that sea of potential and draw usable work without violating conservation laws. Not creating energy from nothing, but converting vacuum fluctuations into measurable energy through boundary conditions. Her starting point was a well-known phenomenon. Under certain circumstances, changing boundary conditions can produce particles from the vacuum. It's one of those physics results that sounds like magic. And then, once you learn the math, sounds like inevitability. El-Sayed's question was engineering. Could you do this efficiently? Could you shape the boundary changes in a way that produces not just a few photons in a lab, but a controllable output? She called her approach dynamic cavity extraction. The lab was modest compared to CERN or Silicon Valley, but the equipment was sophisticated: superconducting resonators, ultra-fast switching systems, cryogenic setups that made metal behave like a dream. Her team worked long nights, the kind where you stop thinking in hours and start thinking in cycles. At first, the output was exactly what theory predicted: tiny, delicate, barely there. The sort of result that makes for interesting papers, but not for power plants. Then, El-Sayed changed the geometry. She introduced a resonator configuration that created a feedback loop, an arrangement where the vacuum-generated photons reinforced the boundary modulation timing, in effect, tuning the system toward its own most productive state. It was a risky setup. Feedback can become runaway. She built safeguards, she ran simulations, and then, late in 2023, she ran the experiment. The sensors recorded an output spike that exceeded predicted levels by an uncomfortable margin, not by orders of magnitude, by enough to make her swear softly and rerun the test. The spike happened again. Her first thought was error. Her second thought was danger. If the system was coupling to something unmodeled, it could be unstable, or it could be revealing a parameter the theory community had underappreciated, that the vacuum, under certain engineered conditions, might yield more accessible energy than expected. Not infinite, not free, but meaningful. Meaningful energy changes everything. El-Sayed did not rush to announce it. She knew what premature claims can do. She focused on replication, control, and safety. She isolated variables. She reduced feedback strength. The spike diminished but didn't disappear. She increased it carefully. The spike returned. The output curve looked like a door cracking open. Her lab notes from that period, later described by someone who claimed to have seen them, included a line written with unusual intensity: "If this scales, it becomes geopolitics." She was right. Energy is not just a commodity. It is the backbone of economies, the silent architecture of power. Every major political and military structure of the modern world is in some way arranged around energy supply. A technology that could extract even modest amounts of energy from quantum vacuum phenomena, if scalable and controllable, would be a strategic earthquake. Soon, El Sayed began receiving invitations from abroad, generous offers, private funding, proposals for partnerships that would relocate her lab. She declined most politely. She insisted on peer review and open science. The offers became less polite. She was visited by officials who spoke in the language of national pride and security. They suggested her work was too important to be shared casually. They asked her to sign confidentiality agreements that would, in effect, classify her research. El Sayed hesitated, not because she didn't understand security, but because she understood history. Classified science can protect. It can also bury. It can turn discovery into property and truth into leverage. She tried to negotiate a middle path, publish fundamentals, protect sensitive engineering details, create oversight. The officials listened and smiled in a way that didn't promise anything. Then, in April 2024, her lab suffered a refrigeration failure. The cryogenic system warmed unexpectedly. Sensitive superconducting components were damaged. The incident was blamed on maintenance error, but El Sayed found inconsistencies, logged parameters that didn't match hardware behavior, a backup alarm that had been disabled, a fuse replaced with the wrong rating. It felt like sabotage designed to look like incompetence. She reported it. The response was slow. She tightened physical security herself, as if a scientist could outmaneuver systems built for secrecy. In July, she told a friend she feared she had created something that would never be allowed to stay public. "The vacuum isn't empty," she said. "Neither is the world." On the night of August 18, 2024, El Sayed stayed late in the lab to run a reduced power test. She sent a message to her team: "I want one clean data set before we pause." The next morning, the lab was locked. The institute director claimed it was closed for safety inspection. El Sayed's apartment was empty. Her colleagues were told she had taken emergency leave for family reasons. Her passport, according to a neighbor, had been delivered back to her mailbox with no explanation. The dynamic cavity apparatus was dismantled within a week. Components were shipped out under sealed inventory orders. The project name disappeared from grant listings. Students were reassigned to unrelated work. The vacuum returned to being a metaphor. Maybe El Sayed walked away to protect her family. Maybe she was compelled to disappear into a classified program. Maybe the simplest explanation is the most human. She discovered a threshold, and the world, sensing its magnitude, closed ranks around it. But her story leaves us with a difficult reflection. We like to imagine that knowledge naturally spreads, that truth is a light. Yet history suggests a darker reality. When truth becomes power, it is not always released. Sometimes it is stored. Sometimes it is rationed. Sometimes it is hidden in the name of stability. In the next chapter, we meet a scientist whose work wasn't about extracting energy from nothing, but about reshaping matter itself, using sound, fields, and structure to create materials that behaved like they were designed for a different kind of world. The world is built from materials we take for granted: steel that carries bridges, glass that holds light, silicon that thinks in pulses. We live inside the civilization our materials allow, and every so often, a new material arrives, quietly at first, and the future tilts toward it like a compass needle. Dr. Mateo Rivas believed we were standing on the edge of such a tilt. He wasn't chasing a stronger alloy or a lighter polymer. He was chasing behavior, materials that didn't just endure forces, but directed them. Materials that could decide how to respond, bending waves, steering heat, shaping sound, hiding from detection, not through magic, but through geometry. He worked in a coastal lab near San Diego where the air tasted faintly of salt, and the building always seemed to vibrate with distant traffic. Rivas was a specialist in metamaterials, structures engineered at small scales to produce properties not found in nature. Early metamaterials had promised invisibility cloaks and perfect lenses, but most of that hype collapsed into hard engineering limits. Rivas kept going anyway. He had a patient mind. He loved the unglamorous work of iteration: print, test, fail, revise. In his notebooks, sketches of lattices and spirals sat beside handwritten notes about resonance, damping, coupling. He spoke about wave behavior, the way a musician speaks about harmony. To him, the universe was not only particles and forces, it was vibration. Everything at some level was a kind of sound. His breakthrough came from an unlikely combination: acoustic waves and electromagnetic fields. Rivas's team built a metamaterial lattice that could be tuned in real time by applying specific field patterns. Instead of a material with fixed properties, it became a material with adjustable response, one moment absorbing vibration, the next redirecting it, the next amplifying it in a narrow band. Think of a wall that can choose whether to be a wall, a window, or a mirror for certain kinds of energy. The first tests were aimed at harmless goals: soundproofing, vibration control in buildings, safer aircraft components. But the lab soon noticed something odd. Under a specific tuning sequence, the metamaterial didn't just redirect waves, it appeared to compress them into a local pocket, creating a region of reduced transmission around it. The sensors read a quiet zone that was quieter than absorption should allow, as if the wave had been persuaded to take another route entirely. Rivas called it the sink. A colleague joked it sounded like plumbing. Rivas didn't laugh. He ran the test again and again, changing the geometry, changing the frequency, changing the field patterns. The sink persisted under a narrow set of conditions, and when it appeared, it behaved like a rule. Rules are seductive, because if you can create a sink for vibration, you can damp earthquakes. You can reduce mechanical stress. You can shield delicate instruments, but you can also create stealth. You can hide objects from sonar. You can distort radar signatures. You can reshape the propagation of signals. A sink in the right context becomes a cloak, and a cloak becomes strategy. Interest arrived fast. First, a defense contractor offered collaboration, then another. Then a visit from people who didn't introduce themselves clearly but asked very clear questions. Could the sink be scaled? Could it be made broadband? Could it operate in air and water? Could it work against multiple sensor modalities at once? Rivas answered cautiously. He emphasized limitations. He insisted the effect was narrow and experimental. But privately, he was afraid that the narrowness was temporary, that the sink was a doorway into a larger design space, and the only thing standing between prototype and application was time. He began to worry about what he had made, not because he opposed defense research outright, but because he opposed secrecy without oversight. He had seen enough history to know that when a technology promises advantage, it is rarely allowed to develop in daylight, and he was increasingly convinced that daylight was the only ethical environment for something this powerful. In early 2025, Rivas prepared a comprehensive paper. Unlike his previous publications, this one didn't just describe performance. It described the tuning algorithm, the sequence that made the sink appear. He argued that if the method was public, the world could debate its use. If it was private, it would simply be used. He sent the draft to a small circle of trusted reviewers. The next day, his lab's network credentials stopped working. An IT incident, he was told, temporary, routine. But the routines piled up. Access delays, hardware audits, sudden changes in security policy. Then came a meeting with administrators who spoke in gentle tones about responsible dissemination. They suggested redacting key details. They suggested postponing publication. They suggested, without quite saying it, that the sync should belong to people who knew how to handle it. Rivas refused to sign the revised terms. A week later, he received a phone call late at night. The voice on the line was calm, almost kind. "You've built something that will be built again," it said. "The question is whether you want to be part of how it's handled." Rivas didn't sleep after that. On May the 6th, 2025, he left his apartment early, carrying a small bag and a notebook. He told his partner he was going to the lab to make copies of his notes. He never arrived. His office was searched that afternoon. The metamaterial samples were moved to a secure storage facility. The tuning algorithm was classified as proprietary intellectual property under an emergency legal claim. Students were told not to speak to journalists. The paper never appeared. And yet, the sync remained as a concept, a haunting possibility. That matter, shaped precisely enough, can bend the world's signals and silences into new forms. In the next chapter, we return to the heart of the series and the hardest question of all, not what can be discovered, but what happens to the people who discover it, when the world decides it can't afford their truth. By the time you've heard enough stories like these, a pattern begins to emerge, not in the details, but in the shape. A scientist reaches toward the unknown with careful hands. A result flickers on a screen. A threshold is crossed. And then, somewhere between discovery and daylight, something changes. The language turns cautious. Doors close. Emails go unanswered. A person becomes a rumor. It's tempting to treat each disappearance as a single mystery with a single cause. But history rarely moves in single causes. It moves in ecosystems, incentives, fear, ambition, pride, bureaucracy, trauma, and the quiet human talent for rationalizing what we want to be true. So in this chapter, we step back from the lab benches, the equations, the instruments, and we look at the human machinery that surrounds them. Start with the most ordinary force, reputation. Science is not a lone genius shouting into the void. It is a community that decides what counts. Peer review is a gate, and gates keep out error, but they can also keep out discomfort. Journals prefer clean narratives. Institutions prefer stability. Funding agencies prefer predictable returns. Even in the most honest systems, there's an unspoken bias toward results that fit inside existing frameworks. When a discovery threatens to rewrite the framework, it doesn't just challenge facts, it challenges careers, grant portfolios, entire departments built on certain assumptions, and people, even good people, can become defensive when the ground beneath them shifts. Then there is the force that rarely speaks its name: ownership. The modern world treats knowledge as property. Not all knowledge, not always, but enough to matter. Patents, trade secrets, classified research, non-disclosure agreements that turn curiosity into contractual obligation. A discovery that could change energy, health, defense, or computation doesn't live in the same moral space as a discovery about a distant star. It enters a marketplace of power, and markets don't reward openness by default. They reward advantage. Then there is the oldest force of all: fear. Not always fear of danger, sometimes fear of instability. If you truly believed that gravity could be biased, or that the vacuum could yield usable energy, or that neural signals could be written as well as read, you might worry about chaos more than profit. You might worry about what happens when a tool escapes its intended use. You might worry that humanity's wisdom is not advancing as fast as its capabilities. In that sense, secrecy can begin as a form of paternalism, a belief that the public cannot be trusted with certain truths. Sometimes that belief is arrogant. Sometimes it is grounded in painful evidence. Either way, it becomes a mechanism. And mechanisms don't require villains. They require momentum. When momentum is strong enough, the individual becomes optional. This is where the stories of the missing scientists feel both extraordinary and familiar. Because even if none of these people vanished due to some coordinated hand, even if every case has a mundane explanation, the cultural pattern is undeniable. We have always struggled to integrate knowledge that forces us to change who we are. We prefer inventions that make life easier without changing our story about ourselves. We accept antibiotics more readily than we accept the idea that consciousness might participate in reality. We embrace new phones more easily than we embrace the idea that memory could be edited. We tolerate new energy sources more comfortably than the idea that time might not be strictly one way. Because those ideas don't just offer tools, they offer mirrors, and mirrors can be unbearable. Imagine what it feels like to be the person holding the mirror when everyone else wants the room to look the same. To watch colleagues smile and then avoid you. To sense your work is being interpreted as a threat. To wonder whether you are still a scientist or something else. An unintentional profit, a liability, a prize. It's possible that some of these researchers ran. It's possible they were taken. It's possible they simply broke under pressure, and the world misread collapse as mystery. But there's another possibility that deserves space, because it is quietly human, that a few of them chose disappearance the way others choose silence, not because they were guilty, but because they were responsible, because they understood that the first duty of knowledge is not to impress, but to protect. If you discovered a lever that could change the world, would you pull it? Would you publish it? Would you hide it? Would you trust us with it? That is the question underneath every chapter. Not, is the story true, but what would we do if it were? And that question brings us to the end of our journey, where the mysteries converge into something less like a conspiracy and more like a confession, that the hardest frontier is not the universe. It's the human heart trying to decide what it deserves to know. In the final chapter, we gather the threads, not to solve every disappearance, but to face what these stories reveal about truth, memory, and the fragile courage it takes to keep asking. In the end, the mysteries don't resolve the way we want them to. We want names, motives, a clean chronology. We want a door that opens and shows us what happened to Elena Rodriguez, Ahmed Al-Khatib, Mei Lin Park, Victor Sokolov, Joe Mercer, Priya Nanduri, Laila Hassan, Samuel Okoye, Amina El Sayed, Mateo Rivas, Keon Alvarez, and the others whose work sits in the shadows of rumor and partial record. We want the world to behave like a detective novel, because detective novels promise that truth is a room you can eventually enter. Real life is messier. Real life is a corridor of closed doors, and the people inside are not always villains. Often, they are frightened. Often, they are tired. Often, they are convinced they are doing the least harmful thing available. Sometimes, they are simply protecting their own interests with the same instinct a body uses to protect a wound. So the honest ending is not an answer. It's a reckoning. Across these stories, the themes repeat with quiet insistence. A scientist follows evidence into unfamiliar territory. The territory suggests a lever, something that can alter the conditions of life. Then the world, sensing the lever, reaches for it, sometimes gently, sometimes with the grip of law, money, or secrecy, sometimes with the simple force of attention, which can be its own kind of pressure. And then something disappears. A person, a data set, a paper, a line of inquiry. Sometimes the disappearance is literal. Sometimes it's institutional. Sometimes it's the slow fading of a question because the question became inconvenient. In that sense, the missing scientists are not only individuals, they are symbols for a recurring tension. Discovery expands possibility, and possibility demands responsibility. The faster possibility grows, the more responsibility feels like a weight we haven't trained for. What do these stories ask of us? As listeners, they ask us to hold uncertainty without turning it into certainty, to accept that the line between truth and interpretation is often blurry, not because truth is weak, but because human knowledge is always incomplete. They ask us to resist the seductive comfort of either dismissal or obsession, to remember that the world is full of strange events that do not require a hidden hand, and also full of hidden hands that do not require grand plots, only ordinary incentives. They also ask us to notice something tender, the moral loneliness of the discoverer. Even if none of these people were harmed, even if some chose quiet lives elsewhere, the archetype remains real. The person who sees farther than the community is often treated as a problem before they are treated as a gift. Because new knowledge demands change, and change is expensive. And yet there is another truth that runs beneath the fear. Human beings have always been more than their institutions. For every gatekeeper, there is a mentor who shares a paper. For every classification, there is a whisper passed along. For every erased data set, there is a copy on an old drive someone forgot to surrender. Knowledge, like water, is hard to hold indefinitely. It finds cracks, it seeps, it returns. That is not a promise of inevitability. It is a reminder of persistence. So what should we do with this collection of stories? Half history, half cautionary tale, fully human? Perhaps the point is not to decide, once and for all, whether any particular disappearance was orchestrated. The point is to ask what kind of world we want to build around discovery. A world where the most powerful questions are owned by the few, or a world where the public has a voice in the ethical handling of breakthroughs, even when those breakthroughs are complex, frightening, or easy to misunderstand. A world where scientific curiosity is rewarded only when it serves profit and national advantage, or a world where curiosity is treated as a public good, guided by values as carefully as by equations. These questions are not abstract. They are already here, in medicine and data and energy and computation. They are here each time a technology appears faster than our ethics can hold it. They are here each time a person's inner life becomes measurable, each time biology becomes editable, each time the fabric of nature looks less like fate and more like design. If there is a single humanistic insight to carry forward, it might be this: truth is not only a fact, it is a relationship. It is the relationship between a discoverer and a community, between evidence and meaning, between what we can do and what we should do. And that relationship is fragile. It requires trust. It requires humility. It requires courage. Not only the courage to find, but the courage to share responsibly, and the courage to listen without panic. Maybe that is why these stories haunt us. not because they prove anything hidden, but because they reflect something we already know, that the future will be shaped not just by what we learn, but by how we behave when we learn it. So when you hear about a lost notebook, a paused study, a vanished researcher, a door that closes too quietly, don't rush to certainty. Instead, ask the question that keeps us honest and keeps us human. If the next great discovery arrives tomorrow, will we greet it with wisdom or only with appetite? And if memory can lie, if time can bend, if the vacuum can hum with power, if the mind can be read, if life can be rewritten, then perhaps the deepest mystery is not what the universe is hiding. It's what we are willing to become when the universe finally answers back.